Who is this creep? Who lives under the house? It all starts with Ki-woo and his family who live in abject poverty. They depend on public Wi-Fi to access the internet and oftentimes go around the house in search of network. They live in a cramped underground basement filled with stinky bugs, and they take on all kinds of menial jobs like folding pizza boxes. But their payments are often cut short due to their incompetence. One evening, while celebrating the small payment received from a job, the family is visited by Min, Ki-woo's friend. Despite the poor house condition, Min walks in and happily gifts the family a special rock from his grandfather's collection. Although the family shows appreciation for the rock, deep down, they wish it was a tangible gift that could help their situation. While drinking and catching up on old times, Ki-woo reveals his family's dire situation to Min. Min is Ki-woo's good friend and had come to visit Ki-woo for the last time before traveling abroad. Hearing Ki-woo's complaints, he introduces Ki-woo to an English tutoring job for a rich family's daughter. Min used to work as an English tutor for the rich family. But since he plans on traveling abroad, he asks Ki-woo to take over the job and look after the rich family's daughter. With the help of Ki-jung's forging skill, Ki-woo forges his college documents and relies on Min's recommendation to get the job. On the day of the interview, he wears his best outfit and goes to the rich family's apartment. He is welcomed by Moon-gwang, the housekeeper, who makes small talk with him while showing him around the house. She tells him that the house was designed by a famous architect and had been around for a long time. Ki-woo meets Mrs. Park. As Min had predicted, she doesn't care about his college documents and only relies on Min's recommendation. She decides to hire him only if she's satisfied with his teaching method. Ki-woo meets Da-hee, the rich family's daughter, and begins to tutor her in the presence of Mrs. Park. Da-hee is shy at first, but after Ki-woo grabs her hands and reassures her, she gets comfortable around him. Seeing this, Mrs. Park decides to hire Ki-woo. She pays him on the first day of the job, and while preparing to send off, her son Da-song walks in, shooting fake arrows. She tells Ki-woo about her son's obsession with Indian costumes and proceeds to show Ki-woo some of her son's art pieces. While escorting Ki-woo out of the house, she begins to talk about how difficult it was to find an art teacher for her son. Ki-woo gets struck with an idea and tells her about his cousin's friend named Jessica, who is an art psychologist with experience in dealing with children. Mrs. Park is impressed and decides to meet with Jessica. Turns out Jessica is actually Ki-woo's sister. After reading online about arts and psychology, Ki-woo's sister shows up for an interview and pretends to be a highly qualified art psychologist. She asks for time alone with Da-song and somehow turns the once chaotic child into a well-mannered child. Mrs. Park is impressed by this. On the other hand, Da-hee is jealous of Jessica's presence and reveals to Ki-woo that her younger brother, Da-young, is faking his behavior. She also makes a move on Ki-woo, and they end up kissing and developing feelings. Meanwhile, Ki-jung is bent on securing the job. She somehow convinces Mrs. Park that Da-song's weird paintings are linked to a trauma he had in first grade. She also points out an unusual part in Da-song's painting and calls it a black box that will help her discover what goes on in Da-song's mind. Mrs. Park is convinced by this and immediately hires Ki-jung to become her son's art therapist. While preparing to send out Ki-jung, Mr. Park comes back from work and is introduced to Ki-jung. He instructs his driver to drive Ki-jung home. While in the car, the driver offers to drop Ki-jung in front of her house. But Ki-jung makes up a lie and insists on being dropped off at a bus station. The driver agrees and concentrates on driving. Seeing as he's distracted, Ki-jung pulls down her pants and hides it in the passenger seat. The next day, Ki-woo and his family enjoy a hearty meal. Ki-jung tells Ki-woo about her plans, and they make their next move. They all plan on securing jobs at Park's family house. One day, while going to work, Mr. Park finds the female pants on the side of his car. He tells his wife about it, and they suspect that the driver had been inviting women to do deeds in the car. While planning on how to fire the driver, Hye-jin walks in after a day of teaching the son. Mrs. Park volunteers to escort her to the gates. As they walk to the gate, Mrs. Park asks Hye-jin about the driver, and Hye-jin reveals how the driver had tried to get to her house. Hearing this, Mrs. Park confirms her suspicion about the driver and worries about finding a new driver. Seeing that the timing is right, Hye-jin tells Mrs. Park about a driver she knows. Mrs. Park is happy about this and arranges to meet the driver. Turns out, the driver's their father. Ki-woo's father, Ki-taek, goes to meet Mr. Park, and after testing his driving skills, Mr. Park is satisfied and agrees to hire him. With the father being hired, they plan their next move, which is to kick out the housekeeper, Moon-gwang. Moon-gwang is a hard nut to crack. She had lived with the previous owners of the house and was recommended to the Park's family by the previous owners. One day while tutoring Dahae, Ki-woo discovers that Moon-gwang is allergic to peaches. With this information, they set out a plan. Ki-woo drops peach fuzz on Moon-gwang, which gives her allergies. As she goes to the hospital for treatment, Ki-taek secretly takes a picture of her and shows it to Mrs. Park as part of their plan. He convinces Mrs. Park that Moon-gwang has tuberculosis and should be kept away from the children. Worried about her children's health, Mrs. Park makes up an excuse and fires Moon-gwang. She then lies to her husband that Moon-gwang voluntarily decided to quit. While returning from work, Mr. Park complains to Ki-taek about the previous housekeeper's excessive eating habits. He also talks about needing a new housekeeper, and Ki-taek uses the opportunity to introduce him to an agency that provides rich families with caregivers, drivers, and housekeepers. Mr. Park is convinced and tells his wife about the agency. In truth, the agency is a fabricated lie by Ki-woo and his family. So when Mrs. Park calls the agency, Ki-jung pretends to be the secretary and asks for certain documents. Soon, Ki-woo's mother, Chung-suk, begins to work as a housekeeper. The whole family is now employed by the Parks. One night, Da-song comments on how the housekeeper, driver, and tutor smell alike. They decide to change their laundry soap and also move out of the underground basement. After a few days, the Park family decides to go on a trip to celebrate Da-song's birthday. They leave the house in the care of Chung-suk. With the Park's family out of town, Ki-woo and his family decide to spend the night at the Park's mansion. That night, they rampage the fridge and open expensive wines. Ki-jung takes a warm bath while Ki-woo looks through Dahee's diary. As they're gathered in the sitting room drinking, Ki-woo tells his family about his feelings for Dahae, and the family fantasizes about the idea of being related to a rich family through marriage. As they eat and drink, they hear a doorbell. The rest of the family hides, and Chung-suk goes to check the doorbell. She sees Moon-gwang, the former housekeeper. Moon-gwang begs to be let in and claims to have forgotten an item in the house. Chung-suk reluctantly lets her in. As she's let in, Moon-gwang seeks permission to go to the basement in search of the item. After a while, Chung-suk goes down to the basement to check up on Moon-gwang. She sees Gwang trying to push over a big shelf and helps her. As soon as the big shelf is moved over, a door to an underground passage is revealed, and Moon-gwang rushes down. Chung-suk follows her closely with curiosity, while Ki-woo, Ki-jung, and Ki-taek sneak from behind to avoid being discovered by Moon-gwang. Down in the underground bunker is a secret furnished room. After the previous house owner left, Moon-gwang brought her husband, Gyun-se, to the bunker. Her husband had fallen into debt and was targeted by loan sharks. To escape, he had hidden her husband in the bunker for over 4 years. Moon-gwang pleads with Chung-suk to keep the secret. She promises to pay Chung-suk monthly to send in food to her husband. But Chung-suk finds the whole situation ridiculous and threatens to call the police. As the rest of the Kim family eavesdrop on the conversation, Ki-taek trips, making the whole family fall down the stairs in a pile. As they call out for each other, Moon-gwang realizes the truth and immediately records them. She threatens to send the video to the Park's family. The situation quickly turns around with Moon-gwang gaining the upper hand. Back in the sitting room, the Kim family kneels with their hands raised while Moon-gwang and her husband enjoy a happy moment. But As Gwang and her husband get distracted, the Kim family rush forward to snatch the phone and delete the video evidence. Hye-jin dashes into the kitchen, gets peaches, and pours them on Moon Gwang. They end up subduing Moon Gwang and her husband. However, they get a call from the Park family. Due to the rain, the camping trip had been canceled, and they were on their way back to the mansion. Mrs. Park instructs Chung-suk to prepare ramen noodles, as they would be back in less than 10 minutes. Seeing the situation, everyone swings into action. Chung-suk goes to prepare the meal, Ki-woo and Ki-jung clean up the mess in the living room, while Ki-taek drags Moon Gwang and her husband into the underground bunker. Unfortunately, the Park's family arrive on time. Ki-jung hides under the table to prevent being seen. Ki-woo hides under Da-hye's bed after returning her diary, and Ki-taek struggles to keep everything in control in the underground bunker. As Moon Gwang tries to escape from the bunker and alert the Park's family, she's kicked down the stairs by Chung-suk. She suffers a concussion from the fall and ends up losing her life. Ki-taek and Gun-se are now alone in the bunkers. Gun-se is a little mentally unstable from spending years in the bunkers. He tells Ki-taek about a Morse code that helps him send messages to anyone in the mansion. Each time he hits a button, a light in the mansion's passage flickers, and anyone with knowledge of Morse code could decipher the message. At the same time, Mrs. Park is eating the ramen prepared by Chung-suk. While eating, she tells Chung-suk about a traumatic experience Da-song had suffered in first grade. According to Mrs. Park, Da-song had sneaked into the living room to take a bite of his birthday cake, when suddenly he saw a ghost in the basement area. Da-song had suffered seizures due to the experience. After the meal, Mrs. Park prepared to go to bed, and the Kim family used the opportunity to sneak out of their hiding places. But suddenly, Da-song comes down from his room and decides to camp outside for the night. To avoid being seen, Ki-jung, Ki-woo, and Ki-taek hide under a table in the living room. On the other hand, Mrs. Park and her husband decide to sleep on the couch in the living room to look over their son. As the Kim family hides under the table, they overhear Mr. Park telling his wife how Ki-taek smells like a boiled rag. The Kim family is hurt by this, but stays still under the table to avoid being caught. After a while, the Parks fall asleep, and the Kims end up escaping from the mansion. It's raining heavily outside. They run under the rain to their house in the underground basement. As they run, Ki-jung asks about their plan for the situation, but Ki-taek tells her not to worry. They get to their house in the underground basement, and it's flooded with rain and sewage. They end up sleeping in an open shelter for the night. The next day, Mrs. Park decides to organize an impromptu birthday party for her son. She invites Ki-jung as Da-song's art therapist, and also invites Ki-woo. She instructs Chung-suk about her plans for the party and goes shopping for food items with Ki-taek as her driver. While returning from the shopping, Mrs. Park comments on the good weather, which triggers Ki-taek, whose family had to sleep in a shelter home due to the weather. He gets further enraged after Mrs. Park pulls down the window due to his bad odor. Back in the Park's mansion, Chung-suk and Ki-jung plan to secretly sneak food into the basement for Moon Gwang and her husband. But Mrs. Park walks in and intercepts Ki-jung. She begins to instruct Ki-jung on the best way to surprise Da-song with the birthday cake. Ki-taek is also busy with Mr. Park. They put on an Indian costume and plan to surprise Da-song before he blows the birthday cake. Ki-taek is uninterested but continues to pretend. Ki-woo is alone with Da-hye. After they have a little romantic moment, he leaves with the rock gift given to him by Min. He sneaks into the underground bunker and sees the dead Moon Gwang on the floor with a broken skull. As he tries to approach Moon Gwang, he's ambushed from behind by Gun-se, who tries to choke him with a rope. Ki-woo fights off Gun-se and tries to escape from the bunker, but trips on the rope and falls. Gun-se catches up with him and bludgeons him repeatedly on the head with the rock. With everyone at the party in the garden celebrating, Gun-se walks into the kitchen, grabs a knife, and heads to the garden. He sees Ki-jung with the birthday cake and runs to stab her in the chest. Da-song faints from witnessing this, and the entire party is immediately filled with chaos. Ki-taek runs to stop the bleeding on his daughter. while Chung-suk fights off Gun-se and eventually stabs him with a barbecue skewer. As all this is happening, Mr. Park doesn't care about Kim's family situation. He yells to Ki-taek for keys to the car in order to take Da-song to the hospital. Ki-taek throws the keys over, but it lands next to the stabbed Gun-se. As Mr. Park approaches Gun-se for the car key, the odor from Gun-se throws him off, and he makes a disgusting face while picking up the keys. Ki-taek is engraved at this, and his suppressed grievances pour out. He picks up a knife, walks up to Mr. Park, and stabs him. As soon as he realizes his actions, it's too late. He runs away and escapes from the police. After a few weeks, Ki-woo wakes up in a hospital bed after brain surgery. Due to the surgery, he develops the habit of laughing at every situation. He's charged to court together with his mother, but the judge ruled their case as self-defense, thereby reducing their sentence to only probation. He goes to visit his dead sister with his mom, but ends up laughing while looking at his sister's ashes. Ki-taek is still on the run. The police keep an eye on Ki-woo and his mother in order to track down Ki-taek. One day, while watching a news report about his family, Ki-woo realizes the severity of the matter. After some months, the police end their tabs on Ki-woo and his mother. Ki-woo uses this opportunity to climb the woods near the Park's family's house. From afar, he discovers that the house had been sold to a German family who had no idea of the incident that occurred at the house. While observing the house from the woods, Ki-woo discovers the bulb light flickering in a pattern. He notes down the Morse code and translates it on the train on his way home. The Morse code is a message from his father. After stabbing Mr. Park at the garden, Ki-taek escaped into the underground bunker to flee from the police. To survive, he sneaks out at night to steal food from the new owners. After discovering his father's whereabouts, Ki-woo writes a letter to his father and promises to make enough money to one day buy the house and reunite with the family.